Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
The Postmistress Who Never Sorted the Letters, a Miss Marple Mystery. Narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome to Velvet Clues. Welcome to Velvet Clues, where mysteries unfold like delicate petals in the moonlight. I'm Connor, and tonight I invite you to join me in the company of that most perceptive of amateur detectives, Miss Jane Marple. Pour yourself a cup of tea, settle into your favourite chair, and let us journey to the village of St. Mary Mead, where even the most ordinary events can harbour the most extraordinary secrets. Chapter 1. Letters in the Storm. The October wind howled through the bare branches of the elm trees lining the village green, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of a long winter ahead. Miss Jane Marple pulled her woolen shawl more tightly around her shoulders as she made her way along the narrow lane toward the post office, her keen blue eyes noting how the storm had scattered leaves across the cobblestones like nature's own correspondence. She had hoped to catch Mrs. Edith Blackwood before the evening sorting was complete. A letter from her great-nephew Raymond in Canada had been expected for days, and Miss Marple found herself uncharacteristically anxious for news from across the Atlantic. The post office, housed in what had once been a medieval merchant's cottage, stood at the corner of Church Lane and High Street, its Tudor beams dark with age and its windows glowing warmly against the approaching dusk. As she approached the familiar green door, Miss Marple noticed something that made her pause. The closed sign hung in the window, though it was barely past 5 o'clock, well before Mrs. Blackwood's usual closing time. More peculiar still, the sorting room window, which typically blazed with light during the evening's work, remained dark. Mrs. Blackwood had been the village postmistress for nearly 20 years, having taken over the position after her husband's death in the Great War. She was a woman of precise habits, as regular as the church clock in her daily routine. The idea of her leaving early, particularly with the evening post still to be sorted, struck Miss Marple as most unusual. A sudden gust of wind rattled the post office door, and Miss Marple noticed that it stood slightly ajar. Her instincts, honed by years of observing human nature in all its complexity, urged caution. She pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. "Mrs. Blackwood," she called softly. "Are you quite all right?" The silence that greeted her was profound and somehow unsettling. The public area of the post office appeared normal enough, the counter with its brass scales, the neat rows of stamps behind glass, the small display of stationery and postcards. But something in the quality of the silence suggested absence rather than mere quiet. Miss Marple stepped inside, her senses alert for any sign of disturbance. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she made her way toward the sorting room at the rear of the building. Here, she knew, Mrs. Blackwood spent her evenings organizing the day's mail into neat piles for the morning deliveries. What she found there made her catch her breath sharply. The sorting room was in chaos. Letters were scattered across the floor like fallen snow, envelopes torn open and their contents strewn about with apparent randomness. The wooden sorting boxes that typically held the village mail in perfect order had been overturned, their contents adding to the confusion on the floor. But it was not merely the disorder that caught Miss Marple's attention, it was the methodical nature of the destruction. This was not the work of a common burglar seeking quick profit, nor the random vandalism of youth. Someone had been searching for something specific, examining each piece of mail with careful attention before discarding it. Miss Marple knelt carefully among the scattered correspondence, her practiced eye taking in details that might escape casual observation. Most of the envelopes had been opened with precision, their contents examined and then discarded. But one envelope lying near the overturned mailbag caught her particular attention. The envelope bore the return address of Whitfield, Hartley and Associates, solicitors of London. It was addressed to a Mrs. Florence Whitman of Orchard Cottage, St. Mary Mead. What made it remarkable was not its contents, though the letter within appeared to concern matters of inheritance, but the careful way it had been opened and then resealed. Someone had taken considerable trouble to examine this letter without leaving obvious traces of tampering. Miss Marple rose slowly, her mind already beginning to work on the puzzle before her. Mrs. Blackwood's absence, the ransacked sorting room, the carefully examined correspondence, all pointed to something far more complex than a simple burglary. The postmistress, she realized, had not merely failed to return home. She had disappeared under circumstances that suggested she had discovered something of considerable importance. The storm outside was intensifying, rain now lashing against the windows with increasing fury. Miss Marple gathered her shawl about her and prepared to venture back into the night. But first she made a mental note of every detail she had observed, filing away the information with the precision of a librarian cataloguing precious manuscripts. As she stepped back into the storm, one question occupied her thoughts above all others. What had Mrs. Blackwood discovered in that evening's mail that had made her disappearance, voluntary or otherwise, a necessity? The answer, she suspected, lay somewhere in the chaos of the sorting room, waiting to be uncovered by those with the patience and wisdom to read the signs correctly. Chapter 2: Secrets Behind the Stamps. The following morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had washed the world clean of its troubles. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and after a simple breakfast of toast and marmalade, she made her way once again to the post office. She had spent a restless night, pondering the previous evening's discoveries, and she was eager to learn what the daylight might reveal. She found Inspector Slack already in attendance, his notebook in hand and his expression bearing the particular gravity he reserved for situations that promised to disrupt the normal tranquility of village life. Sergeant Lake was photographing the scene with methodical precision, while Dr. Haydock stood near the sorting room entrance, his medical bag at his feet, despite the apparent absence of anyone requiring his services. Miss Marple, Inspector Slack greeted her with the grudging courtesy that had developed between them over the years. "I might have expected you to turn up bright and early. I suppose you'll be wanting to know what we've discovered." "I confess to some curiosity, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Has there been any word from Mrs. Blackwood?" "None whatsoever. Her cottage shows no signs of disturbance, and her neighbour, Mrs. Fielding, confirms that she never returned home last evening. It appears she simply vanished somewhere between closing the public office and completing the evening sort." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the state of the sorting room, have you been able to determine what might have been taken?" Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with the careful attention of a man who had learned to trust documentation over memory. "That's the curious thing. Nothing of obvious value appears to be missing. The cash box was untouched, the stamps are all accounted for, even Mrs. Blackwood's personal belongings remain undisturbed. Someone spent considerable time here, but they seem to have been interested in the mail itself rather than anything of monetary value." Dr. Haydock stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "I've known Edith Blackwood for 15 years, Inspector. She's as reliable as sunrise, never missed a day of work, never showed the slightest sign of erratic behavior. If she's disappeared, it's because something has happened to her, not because she's chosen to abandon her responsibilities." Miss Marple moved carefully through the sorting room, her sharp eyes taking in details that the official investigation might overlook. The chaos was even more extensive than she had realized in the previous evening's dim light. Every piece of mail had been examined, but with varying degrees of care. Some envelopes had been opened hastily, their contents scattered without much attention. Others showed signs of meticulous examination, as if someone had been looking for specific information. "Inspector," she said quietly, I wonder if you might examine this envelope more closely. She indicated the letter from Whitfield Hartley and Associates that she had noticed the night before. It appears to have been opened and then carefully resealed. Inspector Slack studied the envelope with professional interest. The resealing had been skillfully done, but close examination revealed the telltale signs of tampering, a slight irregularity in the glue pattern, a barely perceptible difference in the paper's texture where it had been moistened and pressed back into place. Someone took considerable trouble with this one, he observed. Any idea why a letter about inheritance matters would warrant such attention? Before Miss Marple could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of a young man she recognized as Tommy Whitman, Mrs. Florence Whitman's grandson. He appeared agitated, his face flushed from what seemed to have been a hurried journey from Orchard Cottage. "Inspector," he said breathlessly, "I've come about my grandmother. There's a letter missing, something from her solicitor in London. She's been expecting it for weeks, and when it didn't arrive yesterday, she sent me to inquire about it." Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged meaningful glances. "What sort of letter, young man?" the inspector asked. "Something about her late brother's estate," Tommy replied. "Uncle Herbert died 6 months ago, and grandmother was expecting to hear about his will. The solicitor wrote saying there were complications, something about documentation that needed to be verified." Inspector Slack held up the envelope Miss Marple had identified. "Would this be the letter in question?" Tommy examined the envelope eagerly. "Yes, that's it. The return address matches what grandmother was expecting. But why is it here? Shouldn't it have been delivered?" "That," said Miss Marple gently, "is precisely what we're trying to determine, dear." As Inspector Slack carefully opened the resealed envelope, Miss Marple found herself studying young Tommy with the attention she typically reserved for particularly complex embroidery patterns. He was a pleasant-looking young man of perhaps 25, well-dressed in the manner of someone who worked in an office, and his concern for his grandmother appeared genuine. Yet something in his manner suggested an anxiety that went beyond mere worry about delayed correspondence. The letter, when extracted, proved to contain information of considerable significance. Herbert Whitman's will had indeed been complicated by questions about documentation, specifically, questions about a soldier's letter that had apparently played a crucial role in determining the distribution of his estate. According to this, Inspector Slack read aloud, "Herbert Whitman left the bulk of his estate to his sister Florence, but only if certain conditions could be verified. There's some question about the authenticity of a letter supposedly written by Florence's son during the war, a letter that would significantly alter the inheritance arrangements if proven to be genuine." Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of intellectual curiosity that always accompanied the discovery of a truly complex puzzle. A missing postmistress, a carefully examined letter about inheritance disputes, and now questions about the authenticity of wartime correspondence. The elements were beginning to form a pattern that suggested much more than simple coincidence. "Tommy," she said gently, "what can you tell us about this letter from your uncle during the war?" The young man's face had gone pale during the reading of the solicitor's letter. "I don't know anything about such a letter," he stammered. "Grandmother never mentioned anything about correspondence from the war affecting Uncle Herbert's will." But Miss Marple, with her long experience of human nature, noticed the way his hands trembled as he spoke, and she filed this observation away for future consideration. In her experience, the truth had a way of revealing itself to those patient enough to watch for its emergence, like bulbs pushing through soil in the promise of spring. Chapter 3. Echoes from the Great War. The afternoon sun slanted through the lace curtains of Orchard Cottage as Miss Marple settled herself in the comfortable chair that Mrs. Florence Whitman had indicated. The parlour was a museum of Victorian propriety, its surfaces crowded with photographs, porcelain figurines, and the accumulated treasures of a long life lived with careful attention to domestic beauty. But it was the photographs that drew Miss Marple's particular interest, sepia-toned portraits of young men in military uniform, their faces bearing the serious expression that seemed to mark an entire generation. Mrs. Whitman was a lady of perhaps 70 years, her white hair arranged with old-fashioned precision, and her black dress speaking of mourning that had become a permanent state rather than a temporary observance. She received Miss Marple with the courtesy due to a neighbour, though her manner suggested the strain of recent difficulties. "Such a kind of you to call, Miss Marple," she said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who had once moved in more elevated social circles. "Tommy mentioned that you were at the post office when the disturbance was discovered. Such a shocking thing to happen in our quiet village." Miss Marple accepted the offered cup of tea with appreciation. The china was delicate, clearly a family treasure, and the tea itself was of excellent quality, small details that spoke of someone who maintained standards despite reduced circumstances. "I confess to some concern about Mrs. Blackwood," Miss Marple said gently. "She seemed such a reliable person, and her disappearance is most puzzling. I wonder if you might help me understand something about the letter that was found among the scattered mail, the communication from your brother's solicitor." Mrs. Whitman's hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. "I'm afraid there's been some sort of misunderstanding about Herbert's will. The solicitor seems to think there's documentation that I should possess, something that would affect the terms of the inheritance." "What sort of documentation?" Miss Marple inquired with the gentle persistence that had served her well in countless investigations. "A letter, supposedly written by my son Arthur during the war." Mrs. Whitman's voice grew softer, heavy with old grief. "Arthur was killed at the Somme in 1916, just 3 months before the armistice. He was only 19. Miss Marple studied the photograph that held the place of honor on the mantelpiece. A young man in lieutenant's uniform, his face bearing the unmistakable stamp of courage tempered by awareness of mortality. "He looks like a fine young man. You must have treasured any letters he sent from France." "Oh, indeed I did. I kept them all, every precious word." Mrs. Whitman rose and moved to a small escritoire, from which she withdrew a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. "I read them still sometimes when the loneliness becomes too great to bear." She handed the bundle to Miss Marple, who accepted it with the reverence due to such sacred relics. The letters were written in a young man's careful hand, the paper brown with age and some showing the stains of mud and worse things that spoke of the conditions under which they had been composed. "The solicitor mentioned a specific letter," Miss Marple said carefully. "Something that would affect the terms of your brother's will." Mrs. Whitman's expression grew puzzled. "That's what I don't understand. According to Mr. Whitfield, Herbert left instructions that the bulk of his estate should go to Arthur's son, my grandson Tommy, rather than to me, provided that a certain letter could be produced as evidence that Arthur had intended his inheritance to pass directly to his future offspring." Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of intellectual interest that accompanied the discovery of a significant inconsistency. "But Arthur was unmarried when he died, was he not? How could he have had a son, exactly?" Mrs. Whitman's voice carried a note of distress. "Arthur never married, never even had a serious romantic attachment that I knew of. The idea that he might have left a son is impossible, and yet the solicitor insists that Herbert's will makes specific provision for such a grandnephew." Miss Marple examined the letters more carefully, noting the dates and the careful way they had been preserved. Most were routine communications, requests for packages from home, descriptions of daily life in the trenches, expressions of love and longing for peaceful times. But there was something about the handwriting that caught her attention, a subtle inconsistency in the formation of certain letters. "Mrs. Whitman," she said gently, "might I ask about Tommy's parentage? I confess I had assumed he was your grandson through a daughter." The older woman's face flushed slightly. "Tommy came to live with me when he was very young. His parents had died, and I took him in as my own.
He's been like a grandson to me, though there's no blood relation. This revelation cast the inheritance dispute in an entirely new light. If Tommy was not actually Mrs. Whitman's grandson, then his claim to Herbert's estate would depend entirely on the existence of this mysterious letter supposedly proving that Arthur had intended his inheritance to pass to future offspring. Miss Marple carefully examined one particular letter, dated just weeks before Arthur's death. The handwriting appeared consistent with the others, but something about the content struck her as curious. Unlike the other letters, which dealt with practical matters and immediate concerns, this one contained specific instructions about the disposition of personal effects and expressions of hope for the future of the family line. This letter, she said carefully, indicating the suspicious document, seems rather different from the others, more formal somehow, and concerned with matters that a young soldier might not typically address in routine correspondence with his mother. Mrs. Whitman leaned forward to examine the letter Miss Marple indicated. As she read, her face grew pale, and her hands began to tremble more noticeably. "I don't remember this letter," she whispered. "The handwriting looks like Arthur's, but the content, he never wrote to me about such things. He was always so concerned with immediate matters, the weather, the food, his fellow soldiers. This sounds like someone much older, someone thinking about legal matters and family continuity." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. In her experience, forged documents were often betrayed not by obvious flaws in execution, but by subtle inconsistencies in voice and content that reflected the forger's inability to truly capture the authentic concerns and expressions of their subject. "Mrs. Whitman," she said gently, "I wonder if you might tell me more about when Tommy came to live with you. The timing might be quite significant to understanding this puzzle." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the cottage parlor, Miss Marple sensed that she was approaching the heart of a deception that had been years in the making, a careful construction of false documentation designed to support a claim that had no foundation in truth. The missing postmistress, she suspected, had discovered something that threatened to expose this elaborate fraud, and her disappearance was the desperate act of someone who had too much to lose to allow the truth to emerge. Chapter 4: The Forger's Art Revealed. The village library occupied a medieval building that had once served as a guild hall, its stone walls thick enough to muffle the sounds of the modern world, and its diamond-paned windows casting geometric patterns of light across the polished oak tables. Miss Marple had come here seeking information, guided by the conviction that the truth about Mrs. Blackwood's disappearance lay hidden in the documentary evidence of the past. Miss Dorothy Hartwell, the village librarian, was a spinster of indeterminate age whose passion for historical accuracy had made her an invaluable resource for anyone seeking to verify the details of local family histories. She received Miss Marple's inquiry with the enthusiasm of someone who rarely had the opportunity to employ her specialized knowledge in matters of genuine importance. Birth records, death certificates, military service documentation, she repeated, her eyes bright with professional interest. "What period are we investigating, Miss Marple?" "The Great War period, primarily. I'm particularly interested in any records relating to the Whitman family, Florence Whitman of Orchard Cottage, and her son Arthur, who died at the Somme." Miss Hartwell's expression grew more serious. "Ah yes, poor Arthur Whitman. A sad case that, such a promising young man, cut down just months before the armistice. I remember helping Mrs. Whitman verify some details for his memorial service years ago." She led Miss Marple to a section of the library, where bound volumes of official records were kept with the reverence typically reserved for sacred texts. The leather-bound registers contained the documented history of the village, from baptisms and marriages to deaths and military service, each entry made in the careful handwriting of various clerks and officials. "Here we are," Miss Hartwell said, opening a volume to a page marked with a ribbon bookmark. "Arthur Whitman, born 1897, enlisted 1915, killed in action 1916. No record of marriage, no recorded children. A straightforward case sadly typical of that generation. Miss Marple studied the entries with careful attention, noting not only what was recorded but what was absent. Arthur Whitman's military service was documented in meticulous detail, from his initial enlistment through his promotion to lieutenant and his eventual death in action. But there was no mention of any personal relationships, no indication that he had ever contemplated marriage, or had reason to be concerned about providing for future offspring. "Miss Hartwell," she said thoughtfully, "I wonder if you might help me understand something about military correspondence during the war. Would soldiers typically make formal arrangements for the disposition of their personal effects through letters home?" The librarian considered this question with the scholarly attention it deserved. In some cases, yes, particularly among officers who understood the importance of such matters. But more commonly, they would have made such arrangements through official channels, wills filed with their commanding officers, or formal documents prepared by military legal staff. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions about the suspicious letter growing stronger. And would a young man of 19, particularly one with no immediate prospect of marriage, be likely to concern himself with the inheritance rights of hypothetical future children? Most unlikely, Miss Hartwell replied firmly. The concerns of young soldiers were typically much more immediate: survival, the welfare of their parents, perhaps arrangements for personal mementos to be sent home. The kind of forward-looking legal planning you describe would be more characteristic of an older man with established family responsibilities. As Miss Marple prepared to leave the library, she made one final request that proved to be illuminating in the extreme. "I wonder if you might show me any records relating to a young man named Tommy Whitman, or Thomas perhaps, someone who might have come to live with Mrs. Whitman in the years following the war." Miss Hartwell's search through the more recent records revealed information that cast the entire inheritance dispute in a new and disturbing light. Tommy Whitman had indeed come to live with Mrs. Florence Whitman, but not as an orphaned relative. The records showed that he had been born Thomas Blackwood in 1924, the son of one Harold Blackwood and his wife Edith. Blackwood, Miss Marple repeated, her mind working quickly through the implications. Would this Harold Blackwood have been related to Mrs. Edith Blackwood, our missing postmistress? Her late husband, actually, Miss Hartwell confirmed. Harold was killed in a mining accident in 1925, when the boy would have been barely a year old. Mrs. Blackwood was left to raise the child alone, but she apparently felt unable to provide for him properly, and arranged for him to be taken in by Mrs. Whitman, who had offered to care for him as her own. The picture that emerged from these revelations was one of calculated deception spanning many years. Tommy Blackwood had been raised as Tommy Whitman, apparently with the knowledge and consent of both women involved. But at some point, this arrangement had evolved into something far more sinister, a deliberate fraud, designed to establish a false claim to Herbert Whitman's estate. Miss Marple left the library, with her mind racing through the implications of what she had discovered. If Tommy was actually Mrs. Blackwood's son, rather than Mrs. Whitman's grandson, then his claim to Herbert's inheritance was entirely fraudulent. The forged letter, supposedly written by Arthur Whitman, had been created to support this false claim, and Mrs. Blackwood, who possessed intimate knowledge of her son's true parentage, had become a threat to the success of the scheme. As she walked slowly through the village streets, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the careful way the solicitor's letter had been opened and resealed. Someone had wanted to know exactly what the London lawyers had discovered about the suspicious documentation, and they had needed to do so without alerting Mrs. Whitman to the fact that her correspondence was being intercepted. But Mrs. Blackwood, in her role as postmistress, would have been in a perfect position to examine such correspondence, and if she had realized that her son was involved in an elaborate fraud, she might well have confronted him about it, with consequences that could explain her sudden disappearance. The evening light was beginning to fade. As Miss Marple approached her own cottage, but her mind was far from ready for rest. The truth about Mrs. Blackwood's fate lay somewhere in the complex web of deception that had been woven around a forged letter and a false identity, and she was determined to unravel it before anyone else came to harm in the service of such a corrupted inheritance. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Churchyard. The ancient cemetery of St. Mary Mead lay wrapped in morning mist, its weathered headstones emerging from the grey shroud like ships navigating uncertain waters. Miss Marple picked her way carefully along the gravel paths, her keen eyes scanning the inscribed names and dates that told the story of generations of village families. She had come here seeking confirmation of her growing suspicions, guided by the conviction that truth, however carefully buried, had a way of marking its presence for those who knew where to look. The Whitman family plot occupied a prominent position near the old yew tree that had stood sentinel over the dead for centuries before the first stone church had been built on this site. The headstones were well maintained, their inscriptions still clearly legible, despite the passage of years. Miss Marple studied them with the attention of a scholar, examining ancient manuscripts, noting not only what was recorded, but what was conspicuously absent. Herbert Whitman's grave was marked with an impressive monument, its marble surface bearing testimony to a life of business success and community standing. The inscription noted his birth in 1860, his death 6 months previous, and his status as beloved brother of Florence and devoted uncle to Arthur. But there was no mention of any other family relationships, no indication that he had ever acknowledged the existence of a grandnephew. Arthur Whitman's memorial was more modest, but no less poignant, its simple stone cross bearing the standard inscription of a generation lost. Lieutenant Arthur Whitman, 1897 to 1916, killed in action at the Somme, greater love hath no man. Here too, there was no suggestion of any family beyond his mother, no wife left behind, no children to mourn a father they would never know. Miss Marple stood for a long moment before Arthur's grave, thinking about the forged letter that had been created in his name. The deception was particularly cruel, she reflected, because it not only sought to defraud the living, but also corrupted the memory of the dead, transforming an honest young soldier's correspondence into an instrument of fraud.
Her contemplation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel path. She turned to see Tommy Whitman, or Thomas Blackwood, as she now knew him to be, walking toward her with the measured gait of someone who was trying to appear casual, despite considerable inner turmoil. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I didn't expect to find anyone else here so early. I often come to visit Uncle Arthur's grave when I need to think." Miss Marple studied the young man with renewed interest, noting the subtle signs of stress that marked his appearance, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes avoided direct contact, the carefully rehearsed quality of his speech. "You must have felt a great connection to him, despite never having known him personally." "Grandmother spoke of him so often that I almost felt I had known him," Tommy replied, but something in his tone suggested words learned by rote rather than genuine emotion. "She always said he would have been proud to see me grow up in his place." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "It's touching how she took you in after your parents died. She must have felt a special bond with you to raise you as her own grandson." The effect of her words was immediate and telling. Tommy's carefully composed demeanor cracked slightly, and she saw a flash of something, fear perhaps, or recognition that his deception was beginning to unravel, cross his features. "Yes, she was very kind to me," he stammered, then seemed to recover his composure. "But I'm sure she would have done the same for any child in need." Miss Marple smiled gently. "No doubt she would, though I suspect she feels a particular responsibility toward you, given that your mother was so instrumental in arranging your care." Tommy had gone very pale now, and his hands were visibly shaking. "My mother? I'm sorry, Miss Marple, but I think there may be some confusion. My parents died when I was very young, and grandmother never spoke much about them." "Oh, but surely you remember your mother, dear," Miss Marple continued with relentless kindness. Mrs. Blackwood was such a devoted woman, and she must have found it very difficult to part with you, even though she knew it was for the best. The name Blackwood had the effect of a physical blow. Tommy staggered slightly, and reached out to steady himself against Arthur's headstone, his face now ashen, and his breathing rapid and shallow. "You know," he whispered, and it was no longer a question but a statement of defeat. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but her words carried the weight of inexorable truth. "I know that you are Thomas Blackwood, son of Harold and Edith Blackwood. I know that you were raised by Mrs. Whitman out of kindness, not kinship. And I know that the letter supposedly written by Arthur Whitman was forged to support your false claim to Herbert's inheritance." Tommy collapsed onto a bench near the grave, his head in his hands. When he looked up, his face was streaked with tears, and the pretense that had sustained him for so long had crumbled entirely. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said brokenly. "I never meant for anyone to be hurt. When Uncle Herbert's will was read, and I learned about the provision for Arthur's son, I thought it was a sign, a chance for grandmother and me to finally have the security we'd never known." Miss Marple sat beside him on the bench, her manner compassionate despite the gravity of his confession. "So you forged the letter to establish a claim you knew to be false." "I'm good with handwriting," he admitted. "I work as a clerk and I've always been able to copy different styles. I studied Arthur's real letters until I could imitate his hand perfectly, and then I created the document that would support my claim. It seemed so simple, just one letter to change everything. But your mother discovered what you had done." Tommy nodded miserably. "She was sorting the mail when the solicitor's letter arrived. She opened it to see what they were saying about the investigation into Arthur's correspondence, and she realized immediately what I must have done. She knew the truth about my parentage, knew that I could never have been Arthur's son." Miss Marple felt the familiar sadness that always accompanied the moment when human weakness and desperation revealed themselves in all their tragic complexity. "What happened when she confronted you about the forgery?" Tommy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She said she couldn't let me continue with the deception. She said it was wrong to build our future on lies and fraud, that Arthur's memory deserved better than to be corrupted in service of a false claim. She was going to contact the solicitors and tell them the truth." The morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing the village beyond the churchyard in sharp detail. Miss Marple studied Tommy's face, and saw there the collapse of dreams built on deception, the terrible weight of consequences finally demanding acknowledgement. "Where is she now, Tommy?" she asked gently. His answer, when it finally came, would provide the key to solving the mystery of the postmistress who had never completed her final sorting. Chapter 6. The Mill Wheel's Secret. The old water mill stood silent beside the stream that wound its way through the meadows beyond St. Mary Mead, its great wheel motionless in the still morning air. Miss Marple approached the ancient structure with measured steps, guided by Tommy Blackwood's tearful confession, and her own understanding of how desperate people might seek to hide their most terrible secrets. The mill had not operated for many years, its machinery gradually succumbing to rust and neglect as modern methods of grain processing made such traditional methods obsolete. But the building remained sound, its stone walls and slate roof providing shelter from the elements, and its isolated location offering privacy for those who might need to conceal their activities from prying eyes. Inspector Slack had arrived before her, having received her urgent message with the professional urgency that marked his response to her more serious communications. He stood now beside the mill wheel, his expression grim as he contemplated the implications of what they might discover within the building. "Young Blackwood confessed to the forgery then?" he asked as Miss Marple approached. "Indeed he did, Inspector. The poor young man was quite overwhelmed by the weight of his deception, but more importantly, he has revealed the location where he believes we will find his mother." Inspector Slack's expression grew even more somber. "Alive or dead?" Miss Marple's silence was answer enough. They entered the mill through a door that had once been secured but now hung open, its lock broken by someone who had needed quick access and had not been concerned about concealing their entry. The interior was dim and dusty, filled with the machinery of grain processing and the accumulated debris of years of abandonment. It was behind the great mill wheel itself that they found what they were looking for. Mrs. Edith Blackwood sat in a wooden chair, her head slumped forward and her hands folded in her lap as if she had simply fallen asleep while contemplating the view of the stream through a broken window. But the unnatural stillness of her posture and the blue tinge to her lips told a different story. Dr. Haydock, who had followed them to the mill, conducted his examination with professional thoroughness. Poison, he announced after several minutes of careful investigation, administered in liquid form, I would say probably mixed with tea or coffee to mask the taste. Death would have been relatively quick and painless. Inspector Slack was already examining the scene for additional evidence. A small teacup sat on a wooden crate beside the chair, its contents long since evaporated, but leaving behind a residue that would undoubtedly prove significant to the investigation. Near the cup lay a folded piece of paper which the inspector retrieved with careful attention to preserving any fingerprints it might bear. A suicide note, he announced after reading its contents, written in Mrs. Blackwood's hand, apologizing for her inability to live with the knowledge of her son's crimes and expressing her hope that her death might somehow atone for his deception. Miss Marple accepted the note when Inspector Slack offered it for her examination. The handwriting was indeed consistent with the careful penmanship she had observed in Mrs. Blackwood's official postal records, and the content expressed exactly the kind of guilt and despair one might expect from a mother who had discovered her child's involvement in serious criminal activity. A tragic end to a tragic situation, Dr. Haydock observed, packing away his instruments. The poor woman must have felt she had no other option once she realized the extent of her son's deception. But something about the scene troubled Miss Marple, though she could not immediately identify what it was. The positioning of the body, the placement of the teacup, even the content of the suicide note, all appeared consistent with self-inflicted death. Yet her instincts, honed by years of observing human nature, suggested that appearances might be deceiving. Inspector, she said carefully, I wonder if we might examine Mrs. Blackwood's personal effects more closely. Sometimes the smallest details can reveal the most significant truths. The examination revealed several items of interest. Mrs. Blackwood's handbag contained her usual personal belongings, a small purse with a few shillings, a clean handkerchief, a pair of reading spectacles, and a small notebook in which she recorded postal business. But there was also something unexpected, a letter bearing the same London solicitor's return address as the correspondence that had been found resealed in the post office. This letter, however, had been opened in the normal fashion and bore no signs of tampering. Its contents revealed information that cast the entire situation in a new and disturbing light. According to this, Inspector Slack read aloud, the solicitors had already determined that the suspicious letter supposedly written by Arthur Whitman was a forgery. They had subjected it to expert analysis and found clear evidence of deception. Moreover, they had traced the paper stock to a batch manufactured in 1920, several years after Arthur's death. Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of intellectual satisfaction that accompanied the discovery of a crucial piece of evidence. So Mrs. Blackwood knew that her son's forgery had already been detected. The inheritance claim was doomed to failure regardless of any action she might take. Which raises the question, Inspector Slack continued, of why she would choose suicide over simply allowing the legal process to take its course. The forgery would be exposed, young Blackwood would face prosecution, but Mrs. Blackwood herself had committed no crime. Dr. Haydock had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. There's another possibility we should consider, he said thoughtfully. What if Mrs. Blackwood didn't commit suicide at all? What if someone else arranged her death to look like self-inflicted poisoning? The suggestion sent a chill through the dim interior of the mill. Miss Marple moved to examine the teacup more closely, noting details that had not been immediately apparent. The cup was positioned at an angle that seemed unnatural for someone who had been drinking from it, and the residue pattern suggested that it had been disturbed after the liquid had begun to evaporate. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I think we need to consider the possibility that Mrs. Blackwood was murdered, and that her death was arranged to appear as suicide in order to prevent her from revealing something far more damaging than her son's forgery." As they prepared to remove Mrs. Blackwood's body from the mill, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the complex web of deception that had led to this tragic conclusion. The forged letter, the false inheritance claim, and now a suspicious death, all pointed to a conspiracy that went beyond the desperate actions of a single young man seeking financial security. The truth, she suspected, lay in understanding not just what Mrs. Blackwood had discovered about the forgery, but what else she might have learned in her role as postmistress. What other secrets might have passed through her hands in the course of her daily work, secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. Chapter 7. Letters from Beyond the Grave. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sitting room of Rose Cottage as Miss Marple carefully examined the collection of correspondence that had been recovered from Mrs. Blackwood's personal effects. Inspector Slack sat opposite her, his notebook open and his pen poised to record any significant discoveries, while the papers spread between them told the story of a woman whose official duties had given her access to information that others would prefer to keep secret. Mrs. Blackwood had been a meticulous record keeper, maintaining detailed logs not only of postal business, but also of unusual or suspicious correspondence that passed through her office. Her private notebook, discovered in her handbag at the mill, contained entries that painted a picture of systematic observation spanning several years. She was essentially conducting her own investigation, Miss Marple observed, running her finger down a page of carefully dated entries. "Look at this notation from 3 months ago. Letter from Whitfield Hartley and Associates to Mrs. F. Whitman. Envelope shows signs of steaming and resealing." She was aware that someone was tampering with the mail long before the dramatic ransacking of her sorting room. Inspector Slack studied the entries with professional interest. "And here's another one from last month. Second letter from London solicitors to Mrs. Whitman, intercepted and examined by unknown party, contents likely photographed before resealing." She was tracking a pattern of mail tampering spanning several months. Miss Marple turned to another section of the notebook, where Mrs. Blackwood had recorded her observations about various villages and their correspondence patterns. "This is particularly interesting," she said, pointing to a series of entries. She notes that Tommy Blackwood, though she refers to him by his adopted name of Whitman, had been asking unusual questions about mail delivery schedules, and had been observed loitering near the post office during evening sorting hours. The picture that emerged from these records was one of a conscientious postmistress who had gradually become aware that her sorting room was being used for purposes far beyond the simple delivery of mail. Someone with regular access to the building had been systematically examining correspondence, focusing particularly on legal documents and official communications. "But there's more," Miss Marple continued, turning to a section of the notebook that had been marked with a red ribbon. She was also tracking correspondence patterns that seemed to relate to other village families. "Look at these entries about the Hartwell family." The Hartwell entries told a story of financial distress hidden behind a facade of genteel respectability. Letters from creditors, demands for payment, and official communications from bankruptcy proceedings had all passed through Mrs. Blackwood's hands, giving her intimate knowledge of family finances that were meant to be private. "Miss Dorothy Hartwell, our village librarian," Inspector Slack noted. "I wouldn't have suspected financial difficulties. She seems quite comfortable." Miss Marple studied the entries more carefully, noting dates and patterns that suggested a systematic relationship between the Hartwell family's financial troubles and certain other correspondence patterns.
Inspector, I wonder if you might pay particular attention to this entry from 6 weeks ago. Mrs. Blackwood notes that Miss Hartwell had been asking detailed questions about postal procedures, specifically about how long mail was typically held before being sorted and delivered. The implication was disturbing. If Miss Hartwell had been seeking information about postal procedures, and if she had been facing serious financial difficulties, the combination might have created a powerful motive for the kind of mail tampering that Mrs. Blackwood had been documenting. Inspector Slack was already making notes for follow-up investigation. We'll need to interview Miss Hartwell about her knowledge of postal procedures and her possible involvement in the mail tampering, but first let's see what else Mrs. Blackwood discovered. The final section of the notebook contained Mrs. Blackwood's most recent observations, including her growing awareness that the mail tampering was connected to the inheritance dispute surrounding Herbert Whitman's will. Her entries showed increasing concern about her son's involvement and her growing understanding that the situation was more complex and dangerous than she had initially realized. Her last entry is dated the day she disappeared, Miss Marple noted. She writes confronted T about forged letter. He claims it was his idea alone, but evidence suggests more sophisticated operation. Someone with extensive knowledge of legal procedures and access to historical documents. Fear I may be in danger for what I have discovered. Inspector Slack looked up sharply. She knew she was in danger. Then why didn't she come to the police? Miss Marple closed the notebook gently, her expression reflecting the sadness that always accompanied such revelations of human frailty and corruption. Because she was a mother, Inspector. Her first instinct was to protect her son, even if it meant placing herself at risk. She hoped, I suspect, that she could resolve the situation quietly, perhaps by persuading him to abandon the fraudulent claim and accept the consequences of his actions. The sound of footsteps on the garden path interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Miss Marple could see Miss Dorothy Hartwell approaching the cottage, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of considerable agitation. Her clothes were disheveled, her hair was escaping from its customary neat arrangement, and her face bore the expression of someone who had come to a difficult decision. Inspector Slack, Miss Hartwell called before she had even reached the door. I need to speak with you urgently. It's about Mrs. Blackwood's death, and about things I should have told you days ago. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged meaningful glances. The truth about the postmistress's death was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows, brought to light by the weight of conscience and the realization that some secrets were too dangerous to keep. As Miss Hartwell entered the cottage, her hands trembling and her eyes bright with unshed tears, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of the situation. Mrs. Blackwood's careful records, maintained with such devotion to accuracy and completeness, had become the instrument of justice in her own case, ensuring that even death could not silence the truth she had been so determined to uncover. Chapter 8. The Librarian's Desperate Gambit. The confession that spilled from Miss Dorothy Hartwell's lips came in torrents of guilt and desperation, each word weighted with the accumulated pressure of secrets too heavy to bear alone. She sat rigid in the chair that Miss Marple had offered, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white against the dark fabric of her gloves. I never meant for anyone to die, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. When I first began examining the mail, it was only because of my own desperate financial situation. The library salary was never sufficient, and after Father's medical expenses before his death, I found myself facing bankruptcy. Inspector Slack maintained professional composure, but Miss Marple could see the tension in his posture as he prepared to document what promised to be a crucial confession. The afternoon light streaming through the cottage windows seemed to highlight the stark contrast between the peaceful domestic setting and the terrible revelations being shared within its walls. How did you gain access to the postal correspondence? Inspector Slack asked, his voice carefully neutral. Miss Hartwell's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. My position as librarian gave me access to all sorts of information about the village families, births, deaths, property transactions, family histories. I knew which families had recently suffered losses, which estates were being settled, which legal proceedings were underway. It seemed such a small step from knowing about these matters to taking advantage of them. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her keen intellect already working through the implications of what she was hearing. You were intercepting correspondence about inheritance matters, looking for opportunities to profit from information that was meant to be private. The postal system made it so easy, Miss Hartwell continued, her voice gaining strength as the words poured out. Mrs. Blackwood was methodical in her routines, always sorting the mail at the same time each evening, always following the same procedures. I had keys to the post office. She had given them to me years ago when I helped with holiday coverage, and I knew exactly when I could examine correspondence without being detected. Inspector Slack made careful notes as she described the system she had developed for identifying potentially valuable information. Legal correspondence, estate documents, business communications, all were examined and when necessary, photographed or copied before being resealed and returned to normal postal channels. The Whitman inheritance dispute was particularly attractive, she admitted. Herbert Whitman had been quite wealthy, and the unusual provisions in his will regarding Arthur's hypothetical offspring suggested that there might be documentation worth manipulating. When I discovered that Tommy Blackwood was planning to forge a letter to support his false claim, I saw an opportunity to profit from the situation. Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of intellectual satisfaction that accompanied the moment when complex puzzles began to resolve themselves into comprehensible patterns. You offered to help him perfect the forgery in exchange for a share of the inheritance. Miss Hartwell nodded miserably. My knowledge of historical documents, paper types, ink formulations, all the skills I had developed in maintaining the library archives, made me uniquely qualified to create convincing forgeries. The letter supposedly written by Arthur Whitman was as much my work as Tommy's. The confession continued with devastating clarity. Miss Hartwell described how she had researched the appropriate paper stock, identified ink formulations that would appear consistent with wartime correspondence, and coached Tommy on the subtle details of handwriting that would make the forgery convincing to casual examination. But Mrs. Blackwood discovered your activities, Inspector Slack observed. She was far more observant than I had given her credit for, Miss Hartwell replied, her voice heavy with regret. Her notebook documented patterns of mail tampering going back months. She knew someone was systematically examining correspondence, and she had begun to suspect that the knowledge was being used for fraudulent purposes. Miss Marple asked the question that had been troubling her since the discovery of Mrs. Blackwood's body. When did you realize that she posed a threat to your scheme? Miss Hartwell's composure cracked entirely, and she began to weep with the desperate abandon of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. She confronted me 3 days ago, showed me her notebook, told me she had evidence of systematic mail fraud spanning several years. She said she couldn't allow it to continue, that her duty as postmistress required her to report what she had discovered to the authorities. So you killed her, Inspector Slack said bluntly. The words hung in the air like an accusation that could not be denied or deflected. Miss Hartwell's tears stopped, and she looked up with eyes that had gone empty of everything except resignation. I arranged to meet her at the mill, told her I wanted to discuss the situation and find a way to make amends for what I had done. I brought tea, said we could talk privately there without fear of interruption. The poison was in the tea, digital and extracted from the foxgloves in my garden. I had researched the proper dosage to ensure it would be quick and relatively painless. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the terrible calculation that had led to such a cold-blooded murder. The methodical research, the careful planning, the deliberate exploitation of Mrs. Blackwood's trust, all spoke to a mind that had crossed the boundary between desperate opportunism and calculated evil. And the suicide note? Inspector Slack asked. Miss Hartwell's voice was now completely flat, drained of emotion. I forged that as well. My knowledge of handwriting analysis made it relatively simple to create a convincing imitation of her script. I knew that everyone would assume she had taken her own life rather than face the shame of her son's crimes being exposed. The confession continued with descriptions of how Miss Hartwell had ransacked the post office sorting room to make it appear that Mrs. Blackwood had been searching for something, how she had planted evidence to support the suicide theory, and how she had continued to monitor the investigation to ensure that suspicion did not fall upon her. But the weight of guilt had proved unbearable, particularly after she realized that Mrs. Blackwood's death had not actually been necessary. The forged letter had already been identified by expert analysis, and the inheritance scheme was doomed to failure regardless of any action the postmistress might have taken. "I killed an innocent woman for nothing," she whispered. "All my careful planning, all my desperate schemes, they were worthless from the beginning. And Mrs. Blackwood died because I was too proud and too frightened to accept the consequences of my own actions." As Inspector Slack prepared to arrest Miss Hartwell, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of the case. A woman whose professional life had been devoted to preserving and organizing information had ultimately been destroyed by her inability to resist exploiting the knowledge that came into her hands. The very skills that had made her valuable as a librarian had enabled her to become a sophisticated criminal, and the same attention to detail that had made her forgeries convincing had ultimately provided the evidence that led to her downfall. Chapter 9. Truth in the Morning Light. The village church bells were ringing the hour of 8 as Miss Marple made her way through the morning mist to the post office, where Inspector Slack was overseeing the final stages of the investigation. The building that had been the scene of such dramatic discoveries now stood quiet and orderly, its sorting room restored to the meticulous organization that Mrs. Blackwood had maintained throughout her years of faithful service. Tommy Blackwood. She found herself still thinking of him by his adopted name despite knowing his true parentage, sat on a bench outside the building, his face bearing the hollow expression of someone whose world had been completely transformed by the revelation of truths he had tried so desperately to conceal. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his eyes reflecting a mixture of guilt, relief, and the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying unbearable secrets for too long. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for everything. I know that sounds strange, given that your investigation has destroyed any hope I had of escaping the consequences of what I did, but I realize now that living with the lie was destroying me as surely as the truth has." Miss Marple settled herself beside him on the bench, her manner compassionate despite the gravity of his crimes. "The truth has a way of demanding acknowledgement, dear. In my experience, those who try to build their lives on deception find that the foundation eventually crumbles, usually at the moment when they can least afford the collapse." Inspector Slack emerged from the post office carrying the last of the evidence boxes, his expression reflecting the satisfaction of a case successfully concluded, but also the regret that always accompanied investigations involving such tragic loss of life. The systematic mail fraud that Miss Hartwell had conducted over several years represented a profound violation of the trust that held the village community together.
Young Blackwood has agreed to provide full testimony about the forgery scheme, Inspector Slack announced as he joined them. His cooperation will be taken into account at sentencing, though he'll certainly face prison time for fraud and conspiracy. Miss Hartwell will likely spend the rest of her life behind bars, assuming she doesn't hang for murder. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the various motivations that had led to such a tragic conclusion. Tommy's desperate desire for financial security, Miss Hartwell's equally desperate attempt to escape bankruptcy, and Mrs. Blackwood's fatal decision to confront criminals whose desperation had made them capable of murder. All had combined to create a situation where ordinary people had been driven to extraordinary crimes. Mrs. Whitman has been informed about the true nature of the inheritance dispute, Inspector Slack continued. She's taken the news about Tommy's deception remarkably well, all things considered. I think she suspected for some time that there was more to his background than she had been told. Tommy looked up with obvious anxiety. How is she? I know I have no right to concern myself with her welfare, given how I've deceived her, but she was kind to me for so many years. I can't bear the thought that my actions might have caused her additional suffering. Miss Marple's voice carried the gentle wisdom that had comforted countless troubled souls over the years. Mrs. Whitman is a woman of considerable strength and understanding. She raised you with love and care, not because she believed you were her grandson, but because you were a child in need of security and affection. That relationship was genuine, regardless of the deceptions that may have surrounded it. The morning sun was beginning to burn off the mist, revealing the village in sharp detail as it went about its daily business. The post office would soon reopen under temporary management, the mail would resume its normal flow, and the complex web of correspondence that connected St. Mary Mead to the wider world would continue to function as it had for generations. But Miss Marple knew that the effects of the case would linger long after the immediate legal proceedings had concluded. The trust between neighbors had been damaged by the revelation that private correspondence had been systematically violated, and the knowledge that respected members of the community had been capable of such calculated deception would cast shadows over village life for years to come. There's one aspect of the case that continues to trouble me, she said thoughtfully. Mrs. Blackwood's final notebook entries suggest that she suspected the mail fraud extended beyond the Whitman inheritance scheme. I wonder if we shouldn't investigate whether Miss Hartwell's activities affected other families as well. Inspector Slack consulted his notes with renewed attention. You think there may have been additional victims of the mail tampering scheme? I think a woman with Miss Hartwell's systematic approach and desperate financial situation would not have limited herself to a single fraudulent opportunity. Her position as librarian gave her access to information about every family in the village, and her keys to the post office provided the means to act on that knowledge. We may discover that the full extent of her crimes is far greater than we currently realize. The investigation that followed would indeed reveal additional victims, families whose private financial difficulties had been exploited, estates whose settlements had been complicated by forged documents, and business relationships that had been corrupted by the systematic theft of confidential information. Miss Hartwell's activities had created a network of deception that would take months to fully unravel. But even as the scope of the crimes became apparent, Miss Marple found herself returning to the human tragedy at the heart of the case. Blackwood's death represented not just the loss of a faithful public servant, but the destruction of a woman who had tried to do her duty in the face of dangerous opposition. Her notebook, maintained with such meticulous care, had become both the record of her discoveries and the instrument of justice in her own case. As the morning progressed and the various participants in the drama were led away to face the consequences of their actions, Miss Marple reflected on the lesson that seemed to emerge from every such investigation. The desire for financial security, the temptation to exploit positions of trust, and the willingness to harm others in service of personal gain. These were not unique failings but universal human weaknesses that required constant vigilance to resist. The post office would continue to serve the village, the mail would continue to carry its burden of hopes and fears and everyday communications, and life would gradually return to something resembling normality. But the memory of the postmistress who had died protecting the integrity of her service would serve as a reminder that even the most ordinary duties could sometimes demand the highest sacrifices. Chapter 10. The last letter sorted. 6 months had passed since the tragic events that had shaken St. Mary Mead to its foundations, and the village had begun the slow process of healing that follows any profound betrayal of trust. The post office had reopened under the management of Mrs. Sarah Fielding, a capable woman from the neighboring village, who brought both competence and a determination to restore the reputation of the postal service in the community. Miss Marple stood once again in the sorting room, watching as Mrs. Fielding went about her evening duties with the same methodical care that had characterized Mrs. Blackwood's work. The room had been completely reorganized and repainted, but the essential character of the space remained unchanged, a place where the intimate communications of an entire community passed through the hands of someone trusted to preserve their privacy and ensure their safe delivery. "I often think about her," Mrs. Fielding said, following Miss Marple's gaze to the corner where Mrs. Blackwood had fallen victim to Miss Hartwell's calculated murder. "From everything I've heard, she was a woman of absolute integrity, someone who took her responsibilities seriously and paid the ultimate price for trying to protect the trust that had been placed in her." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The trial of Miss Dorothy Hartwell had revealed the full extent of the mail fraud scheme, exposing a network of document theft, forgery, and systematic exploitation of private information that had affected dozens of village families over several years. The woman who had spent her professional life organizing and preserving knowledge had ultimately been destroyed by her inability to resist exploiting the secrets that came into her hands. Tommy Blackwood had received a sentence of 2 years imprisonment for fraud and conspiracy, his cooperation with the authorities earning him some consideration despite the seriousness of his crimes. Mrs. Whitman had testified on his behalf, speaking movingly about the genuine affection she had felt for the young man she had raised, regardless of the deceptions that had surrounded their relationship. "The inheritance matter has been resolved satisfactorily," Miss Marple observed, referring to Herbert Whitman's estate. "With the forged letter exposed and the fraudulent claim dismissed, the original will has been honored as intended. Mrs. Whitman has received her rightful inheritance, which will provide her with comfortable security for the remainder of her years." Mrs. Fielding looked up from the mail she was sorting, her expression reflecting both curiosity and concern. "And what of the other victims of the mail fraud scheme? I understand there were quite a number of families affected by Miss Hartwell's activities." The investigation had indeed revealed an extensive pattern of document theft and exploitation. Miss Hartwell's systematic examination of private correspondence had enabled her to profit from advanced knowledge of estate settlements, business transactions, and family disputes. Her position as village librarian had given her the background knowledge necessary to identify valuable information, while her access to the post office had provided the means to act on that knowledge. "Some of the financial losses will never be fully recovered," Miss Marple admitted sadly. "The damage to trust and privacy cannot be calculated in mere monetary terms. But the legal proceedings have ensured that as much restitution as possible has been made to those who suffered from her crimes." Miss Hartwell herself had been sentenced to life imprisonment for murder, her calculated killing of Mrs. Blackwood being judged as particularly heinous given the victim's innocent attempt to perform her duty as a public servant. The woman who had once been respected as a pillar of the community would spend the remainder of her years reflecting on how desperation and greed had transformed her into a cold-blooded killer. As the evening shadows lengthened across the village, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the lessons that emerged from such tragic events. The desire for financial security, the temptation to exploit positions of trust, and the willingness to harm others in service of personal gain were not unique character flaws but universal human weaknesses that required constant vigilance to resist. "Mrs. Blackwood's notebook has been preserved as evidence," Mrs. Fielding mentioned, "but I understand that copies have been made available to postal authorities as an example of exemplary record keeping." Her attention to detail and her determination to document irregularities may prevent similar crimes in other communities. Miss Marple smiled at this information, finding comfort in the idea that Mrs. Blackwood's meticulous work would continue to serve the cause of justice even after her death. The postmistress, who had never completed her final sorting, had ultimately ensured that the truth could not be permanently buried, leaving behind a record that had enabled justice to prevail despite the efforts of those who had killed her to silence her testimony. "I've established some new security procedures," Mrs. Fielding continued, "additional locks, regular inspections and protocols for reporting any signs of tampering with correspondence. The village may have lost some of its innocence, but it has gained valuable awareness about the importance of protecting the integrity of the postal system." As Miss Marple prepared to leave the post office, she reflected on the complex chain of events that had led from a simple inheritance dispute to multiple murders and the exposure of systematic fraud. Tommy Blackwood's desperate desire to claim an inheritance he had no right to, Miss Hartwell's calculated exploitation of his scheme for her own benefit, and Mrs. Blackwood's fatal determination to expose the truth had combined to create a tragedy that had touched every aspect of village life. The evening mail lay sorted and ready for the next day's delivery, each letter and package bearing witness to the ongoing connections between the village and the wider world. Communications of love and business, hope and sorrow, mundane daily concerns and life-changing revelations, all would continue to flow through this small building, where a faithful public servant had died protecting the sanctity of private correspondence. Miss Marple walked slowly home through the gathering dusk, her mind at peace with the knowledge that justice had ultimately prevailed, despite the efforts of those who had tried to bury the truth in deception and murder. The postmistress, who had never sorted her final letters, had through her meticulous record-keeping and ultimate sacrifice, ensured that the truth could not remain hidden forever. In her cottage garden, the foxgloves that had provided the poison for Miss Blackwood's murder swayed gently in the evening breeze, their beautiful but deadly flowers serving as a reminder that even in the most peaceful settings, the potential for human evil could never be entirely eliminated. But they also served as testament to the power of careful observation and patient investigation to bring light to the darkest corners of human behavior, ensuring that those who exploited trust and took innocent lives would ultimately face the consequences of their actions. The village of St. Mary Mead would heal, as such communities always do, but it would not forget the lessons learned from the case of the postmistress who never sorted her final letters, lessons about the importance of integrity, the danger of unchecked greed, and the ultimate power of truth to survive even the most determined efforts to suppress it. Thank you for joining us tonight at Velvet Clues. I'm Connor, and I hope you've enjoyed this journey into the mind of Miss Jane Marple, as she unraveled the mystery of the postmistress who discovered too much for her own safety. Sometimes the most ordinary services, sorting letters, keeping records, maintaining trust, require the greatest courage. Until we meet again in the shadows of another mystery, may your own letters always reach their intended destinations safely.